The whole village had gathered to watch the chief's son marry the richest girl in the land, and not one of them knew that the real bride was standing at the very back of the crowd, holding a basket, wearing rags. They had eyes only for Zuri. She stood at the center of the festival ground in the golden afternoon light, draped in the brightest ceremonial cloth money could buy, gold gleaming at her wrists and throat, her chin lifted high as the whole village admired her. In a matter of moments, Chief Kand would lift the sacred marriage cloth and join her to his son, Prince Kofi, and she would become the most powerful young woman in the village. The drummers were ready. The elders were rising. The chief was already smiling, and far at the back, forgotten in the shadow of the great baobab tree, stood a thin young woman named Amina, in a plain, clean, earth-colored dress, holding a basket she had woven with her own hands over 7 long days. She had not come to be seen. She had learned long ago that she never would be. She had come only to lay her humble gift at the edge of the celebration, the way the poor bring what little they have, and then slip away before anyone noticed her at all. But here is what no one on that festival ground understood. Here is what the chief, reaching for the marriage cloth, did not know. Here is what proud Zuri, savoring her moment, could never have imagined. The rich girl in the golden cloth was not who the story was about. The poor girl in the earth-colored dress, because among all those hundreds of people, there was one pair of ancient, half-blind eyes that had been searching the crowd, and they had just found the face they had been looking for across 20 long years. An old beggar woman no one ever noticed. A woman who knew a secret about that poor basket weaver that would stop the entire ceremony cold, shame the powerful, and change the future of the whole village in a single afternoon. Who was Amina? Really? What terrible thing happened during a flood 20 years ago? And what forgotten name was about to fall from an old woman's trembling lips and turn this wedding into something no one could have predicted? Stay with me until the end of this one, because the moment that old beggar raises her hand and says one small word, everything you think you know about this village falls apart. If this story is moving you, subscribe now. The ending will change how you see everything. And tell us from where you are watching from us. It was the day of the harvest festival, the greatest day of the year in the village of Untold. The whole village had come. The harvest had been good. The granaries were full, and the festival ground beneath the ancient baobab tree was alive with color and drumming and the smell of roasting yam. Children darted between the legs of the elders. Women in their finest wrappers laughed together in the shade. Traders had come from 3 villages over to sell cloth and beads and palm wine. And at the heart of it all, on a raised platform draped in rich cloth, sat Chief Kand with his son beside him, ready to make the announcement the whole village had been whispering about for weeks. Chief Kand was a good man, and a wise one, and he had ruled Nuko fairly for 40 years. But he was growing old now, and his bones told him that his time was shortening, and there was only one thing left in this world that he worried about. His son, Prince Kofi, was a fine young man, brave, respectful, humble, beloved by the people. But a chief's son must marry, and marry well, for the stability of the whole village depended on a strong and secure line. And so Chief Kand, in his aging wisdom, had made a decision. He would see his son married before the next harvest, and he would choose, for the boy, the safest, most sensible bride he could find, a girl from wealth, from a respected family, whose union would bring security to them all. He rose and lifted his staff, and the drums fell silent, and the whole festival ground turned toward him. People of Nuko, and his voice, though thinned by age, still carried the weight of 40 years of rule. The harvest has been generous. The gods have smiled on us, and on this day of days, I have a joyful announcement to make. He paused, and let the anticipation build. Today, my son will be betrothed. Prince Kofi will marry the richest, most respected young woman our village has to offer, a girl whose family will strengthen ours, and whose union will bring prosperity to Nuko for a generation to come. A great cheer went up, and every head turned toward the young woman everyone had known would be chosen. Zuri stepped forward into the open space before the platform, and she let them look at her. She was beautiful. There was no denying it. tall and striking, draped in the most expensive ceremonial cloth in the whole village, her hair elaborately braided and threaded with gold, cowrie shells and beads glittering all over her. Her father was the wealthiest trader in Untold, and Zuri had never in her life wanted for anything, and it showed in the proud, certain ways she carried herself. She walked into that circle of admiration as though it were hers by right, and she smiled at the cheering crowd, and she did not doubt for one single moment that she deserved every bit of it. What the crowd could not see, what Chief Cand, in his good and mistaken judgment, had never bothered to look for, was what lay beneath all that gold. Because Zuri did not love Prince Kofi. She had barely spoken 10 words to him in her life. She wanted what he represented: the platform, the power, the position of the chief's wife, the status that would place her above every other woman in Untold for the rest of her days. She wanted the crown, not the men. But she was clever enough to hide it behind a beautiful smile, and the village, dazzled by her wealth, never thought to look any deeper. And far at the back of the crowd, in the shade of the great baobab, a very different young woman watched the whole thing in silence. Amina was 19 years old, and she was, by every measure the village used, she had no father that anyone remembered, no wealth, no family name that carried any weight. Her mother, the kind widow who had raised her, had died 2 years past, and since then Amina had lived alone in a small mud house at the edge of the village, surviving on the only thing she knew how to do, weaving baskets. And she was extraordinary. Her baskets were tight and beautiful, patterned with a skill that seemed to come from nowhere, and she sold them in the market for a few coins each, and it was just barely enough to keep her fed. She was teen, and her earth-colored dress was worn, though she kept it scrupulously clean. But there was something about Amina that the poverty had never touched: a quiet grace, a gentleness, a way of moving through the world that made the few people who truly looked at her feel, obscurely, that she did not quite belong among the dust and the baskets. Most people never looked. Of course, to the village of Untold, Amina was simply the poor basket girl, and they walked past her 100 times a day and never saw her at all. The widow who had raised her, a gentle, work-worn woman Amina had called mother her whole life, had been the one person in the world who truly saw her. She had taught Amina to weave, sitting beside her through long evenings, guiding the small fingers over the reeds, praising every crooked early attempt as though it were a masterpiece. And she had told Amina, again and again, 2 things: that she was loved beyond measure, and that she was worth far more than the world would ever tell her. "You carry something in you, my daughter," the old widow used to say, stroking her hair, "something finer than anything gold can buy. One day the world will see it. I may not live to watch, but the ancestors will. They always do." Amina had not understood those words. She had thought them only a mother's fond exaggeration. She did not know how close to a buried truth her adoptive mother had wandered, nor that the widow had carried to her grave a secret she had sworn 20 years before never to tell. When the widow died, 2 years passed. Amina had wept as though the whole world had ended, for in truth her whole world had. And since that day she had lived alone in the small mud house at the edge of Untold, weaving her baskets, greeting the few who were kind to her, bearing the scorn of those who were not, and keeping always the one small habit her mother had made her promise to keep. She never, ever removed the little carved bracelet from her wrist. She had come to the festival that afternoon for one reason. In her arms she held her finest basket, the most beautiful thing she had ever made, woven over 7 days with a special pattern, dyed with colors she had gathered herself. It was a gift, a wedding gift, for the prince and his bride, whoever she turned out to be. Amina had nothing else to give, and she wanted, in her quiet way, to be a part of the village's joy, even from its farthest edge. She would lay the basket at the side of the celebration and offer her silent blessing, and go home. She looked at Zuri, glittering in the light, and she felt no envy, only a small, private wish, quickly folded away, that she, too, might one day be seen by someone. Then she lowered her eyes and held her basket a little tighter and told herself it was enough simply to be here. She had no idea that she was about to become the center of everything. It was Zuri who noticed her first. It usually is the cruel who notice the vulnerable, the way a hawk notices a field mouse. As the crowd milled and cheered, Zuri's sharp eyes swept across the festival ground and landed on Amina at the back. The worn dress, the bare feet, the humble basket clutched to her chest, and a slow, contemptuous smile spread across her face. Here, on the greatest day of her life, was a perfect little nobody against whom she could shine even brighter. "Well, well," Zuri said. "Loud enough to carry? Loud enough to turn heads. Look what crawled in from the edge of the village. The little basket girl." A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd near her. "Tell me, girl, did you come to the prince's wedding dressed in your very finest?" "That old rag." The laughter spread. Amina felt her face grow hot, but she said nothing. She had learned, long ago, that silence was the only shield the poor were given. She lowered her eyes and tried to make herself small, tried to disappear back into the shade of the bale, clutching her basket, waiting only for a moment when she could slip away unnoticed. But Zuri was not finished. She had an audience now. And cruelty, when it is applauded, always reaches for more. And so, though no one but the sharpest eyes would have caught it, Zuri gave a small, sharp nod to one of the children capering near the front of the crowd, a mischievous boy who owed her family favors, and she flicked her eyes toward Amina. The boy grinned, and a moment later, at a full run, he accidentally barreled straight into Amina's side. Amina stumbled. And the basket, her beautiful 7-day basket, the finest thing she had ever made, flew from her arms and tumbled to the ground, and the smaller woven tokens she had tucked inside it scattered out across the dust, rolling among the trampling feet of the crowd. For a moment, Amina simply stared at it, her gift lying ruined in the dirt. And then, slowly, she knelt down in the dust in her clean, worn dress, in front of the whole laughing village, and began to gather the pieces. And the village laughed. Oh, how they laughed! It is an ugly thing, a crowd, when it turns, how quickly good people become cruel when cruelty is easy and someone else began it. They laughed at the poor girl on her knees, in the dirt. They laughed at her scattered baskets. Zuri laughed, loudest of all, delighted, certain she had put the little nobody firmly back in her place on this, the day of her triumph. But not everyone was laughing. On the platform, Prince Kofi had been watching. He was a quiet young man, and a thoughtful one, and he had said little all afternoon, but he had seen the whole thing. He had seen the sly nod Zuri gave the boy, had seen the deliberate cruelty of it, and now he saw the poor girl kneeling in the dust, gathering her ruined gift with a quiet dignity that struck him to the heart. She was not weeping. She was not begging. She was not shouting at her torment. She simply, patiently, gathered what had been broken. Ere face calm her back straight, absorbing the cruelty of the whole village without letting it turn her ugly. And something in Prince Kofi's chest turned over. Before he had quite decided to do it, he was down off the platform. The crowd's laughter faltered in confusion as the prince himself, walked through them, and knelt down in the dust beside the poor basket girl, and began, with his own hands, to help her gather her scattered baskets. The festival ground went very quiet. "They are beautiful," Prince Kofi said softly, turning one of the small woven pieces over in his hands. And he was not merely being kind. They were beautiful, tight and intricate, patterned with a skill he had never seen in the market. He looked up at her, and for the first time, Amina lifted her eyes and met his. "You made these?" "Yes, my prince," Amina said quietly. "Forgive me. I only came to bring a gift. I did not mean to cause a scene." And she reached to take the baskets from him, embarrassed, mortified that the prince himself should be kneeling in the dirt on her account. But Kofi did not let the moment pass. He looked at her, at the calm dignity in a face that had every reason to be bitter and was not. And he felt, powerfully and strangely, that he was looking at something the whole village had somehow failed to see. "There is no need to forgive," he said. "It is they who should ask forgiveness of you." And he said it loudly enough that the nearest of the crowd heard him, and had the grace to look ashamed. Zuri watched all of this from the center of the festival ground, and her beautiful smile grew tight and thin. This was not how her day was supposed to go. The prince was supposed to be looking at her. She lifted her voice, sweet and sharp as a thorn. "Come, my prince," she called. "Leave the basket girl to her baskets. The ceremony is waiting. Our ceremony." And she reminded them all, with those two small words, of what was about to happen. And Kofi, dutiful son that he was, rose and gave Amina one last unreadable look and returned to the platform. Amina gathered the last of her baskets and rose, and stepped back into the shade of the baobab, her heart pounding, and told herself the strange warm ache in her chest meant nothing at all. Chief Cand, who had watched his son's curious detour with a small frown, decided it was time to move things along. He was a practical man, and the sooner the betrothal was sealed, the sooner his greatest worry would be laid to rest. He lifted his staff again. He called warmly, "Let the betrothal begin. Bring the marriage cloth." The great drums began to sound the deep, ancient rhythm of the betrothal, a sound that stirred something in every chest on that festival ground. The village elders, in their beaded caps and their robes of office, rose from their places and formed the traditional half-circle around the platform. Two attendants came forward carrying the sacred marriage cloth of Nuko, a magnificent length of hand-woven fabric, generations old, used to bind the wrists of every chief's family in living memory. It was the most sacred object the village owned. To be wrapped in, it was to be joined before the ancestors themselves. Zuri took a place at the center, beaming, triumphant, exactly where she had always known she belonged. Chief Cand took the sacred cloth from the attendants and held it high, and the whole village drew breath, and the drums rose toward their peak. In a moment, the chief would wrap the cloth around the joined wrists of his son and the rich man's daughter, and it would be done, and sealed, and witnessed by the ancestors, and there would be no undoing it. But Prince Kofi, standing where his father had placed him, was not thinking of Ziri at all. His eyes kept straying, against his will, to the back of the crowd, where a poor girl in a worn dress stood, clutching a basket, watching the ceremony that would bind him forever to a woman he did not love. He could still feel the strange warmth of that moment in the dust, when he had looked into her eyes and felt, absurdly, that he had known her his whole life. He thought, "I am about to marry the wrong woman." And he did not know what to do about it, because he was a dutiful son, and his father had spoken, and a prince does not shame his father before the whole village on the day of the harvest festival. So he stood, and he ached, and he said nothing. And somewhere at the very back of the crowd, another pair of eyes, ancient and half-blind, was fixed on that same girl in the shade with an intensity that had been building for 20 years. The chief turned toward the young couple. He raised the cloth. He opened his mouth to speak the ancient words. And then, from the very back of the crowd, cutting through the thunder of the drums, came a voice. It was not a loud voice. It was thin and cracked, and old, the voice of someone who had not been listened to in a very long time. But there was something in it, some strange note of absolute certainty, that carried across the entire festival ground and made the drummers' hands falter. "Stop!" The drums stumbled and died. Every head on the festival ground turned toward the sound, and a murmur of confusion and irritation rippled through the crowd, because the person parting the crowd and shuffling slowly toward the platform was the very last person anyone would ever have expected to interrupt the chief himself. It was the old beggar woman. Everyone in Ankou knew her by sight, and no one knew her at all. She was ancient, nearly 80, her back bent, one eye clouded white and blind, her clothes little more than clean rags. She lived on the charity of the village, at its very lowest edge, and she walked everywhere with a carved wooden staff, and she was, to the people of Nuko, entirely invisible, a fixture, like an old tree or a stone, that no one troubled to truly see. Her name, though few remembered it, was Mamania, and now this forgotten old woman was hobbling through the parting, astonished crowd, straight toward the sacred ceremony, her one good eye fixed on something with an intensity that silenced the mockery in every throat. "Who dares interrupt the betrothal?" one of the elders sputtered, recovering himself. "Old woman, have you lost your senses? Sit down, before the gods remove you." But Mamania did not so much as glance at him. She kept hobbling forward, past the elders, past the platform, past the glittering, and she did not stop until she stood in the open space at the center of the festival ground, and then, slowly, she turned. Not toward the bride, not toward the prince. She turned all the way around, toward the back of the crowd, toward the shade of the great baobab tree. And she lifted one trembling, gnarled finger and pointed it straight at the poor basket girl standing forgotten in the shadows. And in a voice that broke on the word, the old woman said, "Little Nala." Amina went utterly still. For a moment, nothing happened. The crowd blinked, confused. Who was the old woman talking to? What was a little Nala? People turned to look where she was pointing, and saw only the basket girl, Amina, standing frozen in the shade, her face gone pale. "Old fool!" Zuri snapped, her voice cracking with fury at the interruption of her moment. "There is no one here by that name. That is Amina the basket girl. A nobody. You are pointing at a nobody. Guards, remove this mad—" "Her name," said Mamania, and though her voice was old, and cracked it, now rang with a terrible, quiet authority that stopped Zuri's mouth, "is not Amina." She began, slowly, to walk toward the frozen girl, tears now spilling from her one good eye and running down the deep lines of her ancient face. "I have searched for this face for 20 years, the old woman said, and now she was weeping openly, her whole body shaking. 20 years I have looked at every child, every girl, every young woman in this village and the villages beyond, praying to the ancestors that I had not failed, that she had lived, that I would know her when I saw her. And I had almost given up. I had almost let myself believe she was lost. And then, today, I saw her kneel in the dust to gather her broken baskets. I saw the way she bore it, and I knew. May the ancestors forgive an old woman for taking so long." She reached Amina and looked up into her face with her one good eye, and reached up one trembling hand to touch her cheek. "Only one child in this whole village," she whispered, "was ever called Little Nala. And I am the one who gave her that name." Entire festival ground had fallen into a silence, so complete you could hear the wind moving in the leaves. Let it hang there, just for a moment. A whole village, frozen. A rich girl at the center, her triumph curdling into fury. A chief with the sacred cloth still hanging from his hands. A prince staring at the poor basket girl as though seeing a ghost. And an ancient, weeping beggar woman with her hand on the cheek of a girl. The whole village had spent 19 years refusing to see a girl who has just heard, for the very first time, a name that was stolen from her before she could even speak. Look at Amina's face right now, frozen in the shade. Remember it? Because the poor basket girl of Nuko is about to disappear forever, and something no one imagined is about to take her place. Speak, old mother. It was Chief Kand. He had lowered the sacred cloth, and he was staring at the beggar woman with a strange, as though her cracked old voice had stirred something long buried in his own memory. "What is this name? What do you mean by it? Speak plainly, before the whole village." Mamania turned to face the chief, keeping one hand on Amina's arm, as though afraid she might vanish, and she began to tell a story that reached back 20 years, into a grief the whole village had long since stopped speaking of. "You are old enough to remember, my chief," she said, "the year of the great flood, when the river rose in the night without warning, and swept through the low houses, and took so many from us before the dawn. You remember it?" The chief's face changed. "I remember it," he said quietly. "No one who lived through that night has ever forgotten it. Then perhaps you remember a man named Obi, your own dear friend, the man who farmed the land by the river bend." Chief Kand went absolutely white. "Obi!" he whispered, and the name seemed to cost him something to say. Obi was the closest friend of my youth. He saved my life once, when we were young men, pulled me from a river current that would have drowned me. I owed him a debt I could never repay." His voice caught. "He died in the flood. He and his whole family, his wife, his little daughter, all of them taken by the water in a single night. I grieved him for years." "He died in the flood," Mamania agreed softly, "and his wife died, but his daughter did not." A gasp went through the crowd. "I was there that night," the old woman went on, and her voice shook with the weight of 20 years. "In those days I did washing and small work for the families near the river. I had known Obi's household. I had held his baby girl in my own arms. And on the night the flood came, when the water was rising and the screaming had begun, I was near their house. I saw it taken by the river. I saw Obi push his wife and child toward higher ground before the water took him. The mother did not survive it, but the child, the tiny girl. I found her, caught in the branches of a fallen tree, half drowned, cold as death, but alive. I pulled her out with my own 2 hands, and I saved her. Tears were streaming down the chief's face. Now the whole village stood frozen, hanging on every cracked and trembling word. Old men who remembered the flood bowed their heads. Women pressed their hands to their mouths. For 20 years this grief had lain buried under the ordinary business of living, and now the old beggar's voice was pulling it up into the light, whole and terrible and unhealed. I tried to tell people, Mama Nia said, and now a bitterness crept into her ancient voice. When the waters went down, I tried to tell them the child had lived. I carried her through this very village, from door to door. But who would listen to me? She looked around at them all, at the villagers who had ignored her for decades. I was poor. I was nobody, a washerwoman with no name and no standing. They said the old woman had gone mad with grief. They said the whole family had drowned, and that I had found some other child. No one of importance would believe that a poor old woman could be telling a truth the great and powerful had already decided was false. And I was afraid that if I made too much noise, whoever had let that family be forgotten might decide the child was inconvenient. So I did the only thing I could. She looked up at Amina, and her weeping face filled with a fierce, aching tenderness. I took her, in secret, to the kindest soul I knew, a poor basket-weaving widow who lived alone at the edge of the village, and had always longed for a child. I placed the baby in her arms, and I told her to raise the girl as her own, and to keep her safe, and to tell no one. And that good woman did. She named the child Amina, and she loved her, and she raised her, and she wove baskets to feed her, and she taught the girl everything she knew. Mama Nia's voice broke completely, but before I gave the baby away, I had given her a name of my own. A secret name, a name only I ever used, whispered over her while she slept on the one night she was mine to protect. I called her Little Nala, after the flower that blooms by the river, because she had survived the water. She turned to the chief, drawing herself up as tall as her bent old back would allow. That girl standing there in the worn dress, the one your village has spent 19 years calling a nobody. She is Nala, the daughter of Obi, the daughter of the man who saved your life. The festival ground erupted into chaos, gasps, shouts, cries of disbelief. It was too much, too impossible. And through it all, one sharp voice cut like a blade. "Lies!" Zuri shrieked, her beautiful composure shattered at last, her face ugly with panic and rage. "It is all lies, the ravings of a senile old beggar who wants attention. Are you truly going to halt my wedding? My wedding, on the word of a mad woman and a basket girl? Where is your proof?" There is no proof. There is nothing but an old fool's story. And for a moment, the doubt in the crowd swelled, because it was an impossible tale. And Zuri was rich and beautiful and certain, and the old woman was only a beggar. But Mama Nia was not finished. "Proof," the old woman said, and she smiled a slow, toothless smile. "You want proof." She turned to Amina, and her voice gentled. "Child, on your wrist, the bracelet you have worn since before you can remember, the one your mother told you never to take off. Show them." Amina, trembling, her whole world spinning, lifted her arm, and there, on her thin wrist, was a small bracelet of carved wood and worn cord. A thing she had worn her entire life, so familiar she had long since stopped seeing it. A thing her adoptive mother had told her, always, that she must never lose. "I carved the pattern on that bracelet myself," said Mama Nia, "the night I'd pulled her from the flood so that I would always know her again. A pattern of the Nala flower and the river. But that is not all." She turned to the chief, and her one eye blazed. "Obi was your brother in all but blood. Ask yourself, my chief, when his daughter was born, did he not come to you? Did he not, in the old way, have a matching pair of tokens carved, one for the child, and one entrusted to his dearest friend, so that the two families would be bound across the generations. Search your own house, Chief Kand. Somewhere among the treasures of your fathers, you hold the twin of that bracelet. You have held it for 20 years, and forgotten what it was." The chief staggered as though struck. His face went slack with a dawning, terrible remembering. He turned and spoke a frantic, broken command to one of his attendants, who actually ran from the festival ground toward the chief's compound, and the whole village waited in a silence so thick it seemed to press upon the skin, while the drums stood silent, and the sacred cloth hung forgotten, and the rich bride stood shaking at the center of it all. The attendant returned, breathless, and placed something in the chief's trembling hands, a small, ancient bracelet of carved wood. The cord, long since rotted and replaced, kept all these years in a box of old and sacred things. Chief Kand held it up, and then, with hands that would barely obey him, he carried it across the festival ground to where Amina stood, and he held his ancient bracelet up beside the one on her wrist. They were a matched pair. The same hand had carved them, the same Nala flower, the same winding river, twin halves of a single design, separated for 20 years, and now, at last, side by side. A great sound went up from the crowd. Not a cheer, but something deeper. A collective cry of astonishment and grief and wonder. There could be no doubt now. No lie could stand against it. The poor basket girl of Enuko was the lost daughter of Obi, the daughter of the man who had once pulled Chief Kand from the flood and saved his life. The chief looked at the two bracelets in his hands, and then at the frightened, overwhelmed young woman before him, and something broke open in his aiding face. "I made a promise," he said hoarsely, and now he was weeping without shame before his whole village. "When we were young men, after Obi pulled me from that river, I swore to him. I said, 'Obi, if the ancestors ever grant it, if you ever have a child and that child is ever in need, she will always have a home beside mine. Your blood will be my blood.'" He shut his eyes, and then the flood came, and I believed his whole line was gone, and in my grief I let the promise die with him. For 20 years the daughter of the man who saved my life has lived at the edge of my own village, in poverty, weaving baskets, mocked by my own people, while I looked right through her. May Obi forgive me. May the ancestors forgive me. And then the chief's grief turned, and his eyes found Zuri. The truth of the whole day was laid bare now for everyone to see. This proud, glittering girl had not merely mocked a nobody. She had mocked and humiliated the daughter of a hero, the child of the man to whom the chief owed his very life. And more than that, those near the front had seen the sly nod she gave the boy, understood now that the accident with the basket had been no accident at all, but a cruelty she had arranged for her own amusement. The village looked at Zuri, truly looked at her, at last, and saw not the radiant bride they had been so dazzled by, but the cold and scheming heart beneath the gold. Her wealth had bought her the whole village's admiration. It could not buy her a scrap of it now. Zuri looked around at the turning faces, at the disgust dawning where worship had been, and she understood that she had lost not the wedding only, but her standing, her reputation, the admiration she had built her whole life upon. With a strangled cry of humiliation, she snatched up her fine skirts and fled the festival ground, and the crowd parted to let her pass, and no one, not one person, moved to stop her or call her back. And the villagers who had laughed at the basket girl, on her knees, in the dust, lowered their heads, every one of them, and could not meet the eyes of the young woman they had scorned for 19 years. Chief Kand stood for a long moment, holding the two bracelets, gazing at the daughter of his old friend, and then, slowly, he turned to his son, and he did something no chief had ever done. "My son," he said, and his voice carried across the silent festival ground. "This morning I stood before our people, and I told them that I would choose your bride. I told you that wisdom lay in wealth, and security in a great name, and that a father knows best what his son needs." He shook his head slowly, and a sad, wondering smile touched his old face. "I was a fool. I looked at gold, and I called it worth. I looked at a proud girl in fine cloth, and I called it a good match. And all the while, the truest heart in this village stood weeping at its edge, and I did not see her eye, who owed everything to her father. He drew a breath. I will not make that mistake again, and so, today, before all our people, I will not choose your bride. He looked at Kofi, and his eyes shone. You will choose with your own heart, my son. I have learned, too late to be proud of it, that the heart sees truer than the eye. A murmur ran through the crowd. Prince Kofi stepped down from the platform. He walked out into the open space at the center of the festival ground, the space where Zuri had stood in her glory not an hour before, and every eye followed him. He walked past the rich merchant's daughters who had dressed so finely in hope of catching his notice. He walked past the elders in their beaded caps. He walked past the whole cheering, weeping, astonished village. And he did not stop until he stood before the poor basket girl Nala, the daughter of Obi. Amina, who had woven baskets to survive, standing in her worn and dusty dress in the shade of the great baobab tree, and Prince Kofi knelt down in the dust before her. The whole village gasped. He did not kneel because she had turned out to be highborn. He had not known that when his heart first turned toward her, kneeling in the dirt to gather her broken baskets. He did not kneel because of the bracelet, or the flood, or the debt his father owed. He knelt for the reason he had felt from the very first moment he saw her, because she had been given every reason in the world to become bitter and cruel and hard, and she had remained, through all of it, gentle and kind and good. He had watched a whole village mock her, and he had watched her refuse to let that village make her ugly, and he had understood, in that moment, that this was the rarest and most valuable thing a person could ever be. I have watched you for less than an hour, Prince Kofi said, looking up at her, and I have seen more true nobility in you than in all the gold in this village. I do not ask you to marry me because of who your father was. I did not even know it an hour ago. I ask because of who you are. Nala, Amina, whatever name you carry, I have never in my life seen anyone bear cruelty with such grace, or so little, with so much kindness. Will you have me? Not as a prince, as a man who has finally learned to see. And Amina Nala, the girl who had come to the festival only to lay down a humble gift and slip away unseen, looked down at the kneeling prince through her tears, and at the weeping old woman who had saved her life and searched for her for 20 years, and at the chief who had loved her father, and at the whole village that had looked right through her for 19 years and was seeing her, at last, for the very first time. And at the edge of it all, leaning on her carved wooden staff, old Mama Nia watched the girl she had pulled from the flood so long ago, and her ancient, weathered face broke into a smile of such deep and peaceful joy that it seemed to hold all the patience of her 20 years of searching. She had not failed. She had lived to see it. The child had survived the water and grown into a good woman, and been known at last. For the elders of Enkyo tell their children, to this very day, an old saying that was born on that festival ground, that the flood may carry away the house, and the years may bury the name, and the proud may trample the flower into the dust, but a seed of true worth, once planted, cannot be drowned, or forgotten, or crushed forever. It waits in the poor girl weaving baskets at the edge of the village. It waits in the old woman no one troubles to see, and when its season finally comes, it blooms so brightly that a whole village, which walked past it for 20 years, must stop and stare, and finally understand what was growing among them all along. For gold buys the eye, but it cannot buy the heart's true sight. Wealth may win the admiration of the crowd, but it is kindness, quiet, unrewarded, unwitnessed kindness, that the ancestors are watching and remembering and waiting to lift up in its proper time. A promise made in gratitude can sleep for 20 years and still wake to change a life. And the person a whole village overlooks may be, all along, the very one it was searching for. As the drums of Enkyo began again, no longer for the wedding that was to have been, but for a truer one that no one had foreseen, the whole village witnessed a different kind of ceremony, one built not on wealth, or status, or the loud certainty of the powerful, but on truth and gratitude, and a kindness that had survived long enough, at last, to be recognized. If Amina's story moved your heart, if you believe that true worth is measured by the goodness of a person and not by the gold they wear, then do something for me now. Type the word bloom in the comments, so I know this story reached you. Share it with someone who has ever been overlooked and who needed to be reminded that their kindness has not gone unseen. Subscribe to our family if you have not yet, so you never miss a story, and I will see you in the next one.